The ghost town. The government erased. And why you were never told. The first hint was an anomaly, buried deep within layers of digitized cadastral maps I was sifting through for a freelance project. My work often involves poring over land records, zoning laws, and historical geographical data, usually tedious stuff for developers or environmental impact reports. This time, I was cross-referencing old survey markers in a remote, sparsely populated region of the American West, a place known more for its abandoned mines and wide-open spaces than for secrets. I was looking at maps from the late 1940s and early 1950s, comparing them to contemporary satellite imagery and GIS data. Most discrepancies were mundane: a road slightly rerouted, a farm boundary adjusted, a small reservoir added. But then I found it. An entire cluster of buildings, clearly marked on the 1952 survey map as Merritt Township, with a defined street grid, a public square labeled Town Green, and even markers for school and church. It wasn't a large settlement, perhaps a few hundred buildings at most, suggesting a population possibly in the low thousands, maybe less. It was located in a valley floor near a river marked Willow Creek, surrounded by state forest land and rugged terrain. The anomaly wasn't just that the town was gone, it was that there was nothing there now. Satellite images showed undisturbed forest canopy where the town green should be. Ground-level photos, pulled from various public databases and geotagged hiking forums, showed only trees, underbrush, and the meandering course of the creek. There were no ruins, no foundations, no telltale grid patterns visible from the air, not even significant changes in vegetation that might suggest old, disturbed ground. It was as if the land itself had been reset. My initial thought was simple error. Maybe the map was mislabeled, or the town was proposed but never built. But the detail on the map was too specific. Individual building footprints, street names like Elm, Oak, Maine. This wasn't a planner's sketch. It was a survey of an existing place. I checked later maps. The 1960 survey map of the area showed state forest land covering the exact location of Merritt. No mention of the town. The 1956 map also showed forest. I dug back further. The 1948 map showed a nascent settlement, a scattering of structures labeled simply Willow Creek Settlement. The growth between 48 and 52 was rapid, suggesting a boom. Then, complete disappearance by 56. A town that appeared, grew, and vanished within less than a decade, leaving no trace. And critically, no historical record I could immediately access mentioned it. No local histories of the county, no state historical society archives, at least not in the easily searchable online databases, no newspaper archives from nearby regional towns mentioning a place called Merritt, or a settlement on Willow Creek that boomed and busted so dramatically. This wasn't just an abandoned mining camp. This felt deliberate. The absence of any mention in the official records was more unsettling than the physical disappearance. Towns, even failed ones, leave ghosts, foundations, cemeteries, entries in census records, old photographs, stories. Merritt left nothing. I set the freelance work aside. The anomaly had snagged my attention like burr. My background isn't strictly investigative journalism, but my work requires meticulous research and cross-referencing disparate data sets. And I have a nose for things that don't add up. I started broader searches: county records for the 1950s, state archives, federal land use documents. The name Merritt in that specific county during that time frame yielded nothing related to a town. Searches for Willow Creek Settlement were similarly fruitless in official capacities. bringing up only geographical references to the creek itself. It was as if the bureaucratic memory of the place had been wiped clean. This level of erasure, especially for a settlement substantial enough to have a plotted street grid and public buildings, felt impossible without intent. Natural disasters like floods or fires can devastate a town, but they rarely obliterate all physical trace and all administrative records simultaneously. My research expanded to less official sources. Local historical forums? Nothing. Genealogy sites? No family trees with roots in a town called Merritt in that specific county. Old photo archives? Libraries? Museums? Silence. The silence was deafening. It suggested not neglect, but active removal. Someone or some entity had gone to significant lengths to make sure Merritt, whatever it was, ceased to exist in every practical sense: physical, historical, and administrative. This kind of capability, this level of coordination across different branches of record keeping and land management, pointed in one direction: the government. But why? What could a small town in a remote valley have been involved in that warranted such a complete and utter disappearance? The time frame, the early to mid-1950s, immediately brought certain historical contexts to mind: the Cold War, early nuclear programs, covert military projects, perhaps something related to resource extraction deemed strategically important. But these were just guesses. I needed something concrete. I decided I needed to get closer to the source. Digital breadcrumbs had led me to the edge of the mystery, but further progress required different methods: physical records, local knowledge, however old or fragmented, and potentially a visit to the site itself. The county records office seemed a logical next step. While online databases were scrubbed, physical archives sometimes contained oversights or less accessible documents. I planned a trip. The county seat, a small town itself, was a day's drive away. My cover story was simple and largely true. I was researching historical land use patterns in the region for a private client, leaving the specific anomaly part out. This allowed me to request access to older land deeds, tax records, and property maps without raising immediate suspicion. I spent 3 days poring over dusty ledgers and brittle papers. Most records were for farms, ranches, or timber leases. I found some references to land parcels within the general vicinity of where Merritt should have been, but they were all large tracts registered under state or federal forest designations dating back to the late 1950s. No individual property deeds for town lots matching the grid pattern I saw on the 52 map. No tax records for residents or businesses in a place called Merritt. It was a blank space in the administrative history, mirroring the blank space on the modern maps. The only faint echo I found was a marginal note in a county planning commission meeting minute book from late 1955. It was a brief, almost throwaway line amidst discussion of road maintenance budgets and school district boundaries. Item 7B, discussion regarding the status of the temporary exclusion zone near Willow Creek and the reallocation of associated county resources. Temporary exclusion zone. This was the first official-sounding term I'd encountered that hinted at something unusual in that specific location during that time. Temporary suggested a short-term issue, but the reallocation of resources implied something significant enough to impact county budget planning. There was no further detail in the minutes, just a note that the discussion took place behind closed doors, citing matters of state and federal coordination. This was it. The first solid connection to higher authority involvement. State and federal coordination regarding an exclusion zone in the precise area where a town had just vanished from all records. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. This wasn't a natural disaster or economic collapse story. This was a story of official action, deliberate, coordinated, and secret. I made inquiries, casual at first, with long-time county employees. Had anyone ever heard of a settlement, perhaps a temporary one, near Willow Creek in the 50s? Most were too young to remember or were relatively new to the area. One older gentleman, retired but still volunteering at the archives, paused when I mentioned Willow Creek in the 50s. He got a guarded look in his eyes. Willow Creek? That area was restricted for a while back then, he mumbled, looking away. Something going on up there. Government work. Nobody talked much about it. Folks were told to stay away. He wouldn't elaborate, his voice trailing off. He clearly knew something, or suspected something, but was unwilling or afraid to share it. The fear felt palpable, even after all these decades. It wasn't just a forgotten place. It was a place associated with fear and silence. The pattern was consistent. The town existed. It grew. Something happened. The government stepped in. The town vanished, and an official silence descended, enforced or self-imposed. The exclusion zone note suggested a reason for people to stay away, for the area to be sealed off. But what was happening inside the zone? What was so critical it required erasing a town and its history? I needed to find someone who remembered more than just rumors of restrictions, someone who might have lived nearby, or perhaps, against all odds, someone who had lived in Merritt before it disappeared. The latter seemed impossible given the apparent thoroughness of the erasure, but I couldn't rule it out entirely. The temporary exclusion zone suggested the area might have been reopened eventually, or at least the restrictions loosened. If so, people might have returned to nearby areas, carrying fragmented memories. My next step involved digging into old regional newspapers, not just the official archives, but smaller local weeklies if I could find them. These often contained community news, personal announcements, and local gossip that might have inadvertently mentioned the town or events around it before the official curtain fell. I focused on papers from the mid-1950s, from towns within a 50-mile radius of the Willow Creek area. It was painstaking work, scrolling through microfiche or brittle newspaper pages. Most of it was irrelevant. Farm prices, church socials, high school sports. But slowly, painstakingly, I started finding tiny fragments. A real estate advertisement from early 1955 mentioning attractive new homes available in the burgeoning Willow Creek Valley area, ideal for families seeking opportunity. Another, a classified ad later that year listing urgent need for skilled laborers for government project near redacted town name, assumed proximity to Willow Creek. High wages, housing provided. Government project, high wages, housing provided. This supported the idea of a sudden influx of people, possibly tied to official work, explaining the rapid growth I saw on the maps. But the classified ad was vague, citing proximity to a town 50 miles away, not naming Merritt directly. Then I found something more direct. An article from a small-town paper in late 1955 buried deep in the local news section. It was a brief report on traffic disruptions on the old state road leading towards Willow Creek. It mentioned increased truck traffic associated with the government's Project Nightingale in the valley, and advised local drivers to use alternative routes. Project Nightingale, the first potential name for whatever the government was doing there. The article was short, presented as a minor inconvenience, and offered no details about the project itself. But it confirmed government activity and gave it a code name. This was a breakthrough. Now I had something specific to search for. Project Nightingale, 1950s, associated with the Willow Creek area. This shifted my research from trying to prove a town existed to trying to figure out what happened at a known, to a limited local audience at the time, government project site that had swallowed a town whole. It also suggested the project might have been the reason for the town's existence. Built quickly to support the project, then erased along with it. The newspaper article was dated November 1955. The county minute referring to the exclusion zone and state and federal coordination was from December 1955. The 1956 map showed forest where the town had been. The timeline was tightening. The town must have been emptied and potentially dismantled or destroyed very quickly in late 1955 or early 1956. The speed and thoroughness of this action suggested either extreme urgency or a need for absolute secrecy. Given the Cold War context, Project Nightingale sounded potentially military or related to strategic resources or research. The remote location fit this profile. But what kind of project required this level of secrecy to the point of disappearing an entire town and its history? And what happened to the people who lived there? Were they simply relocated? If so, where? And why the need to erase all trace of their former home? These questions gnawed at me. I knew I was onto something significant, something that went far beyond a simple historical anomaly. This felt like uncovering a deliberate lie, a gap in the accepted history that someone had worked very hard to create. The next step was to leverage Project Nightingale. This name, however vague, was my new key. I started searching federal archives, military records, declassified if possible, and historical indexes using this term in conjunction with the time frame and geographical area. This was significantly harder than searching for town names. Government projects, especially sensitive ones from the Cold War era, were often heavily classified, and even declassified records could be heavily redacted or catalogued under obscure references. I spent weeks requesting documents under the Freedom of Information Act, FOIA, hitting brick walls and receiving heavily censored files that shed no light on anything in the Willow Creek area. Project Nightingale yielded generic results about various minor military or research initiatives, none located in my target region. It was possible the project name in the newspaper was a local nickname, a slight variation, or even a deliberate misdirection. I returned to the physical records, focusing on land ownership and transfer documents from the 1950s in the county. I reasoned that if the government took over the land where the town was located, there must have been some kind of legal process, however expedited or obscured. Eminent domain, perhaps? Or mass purchase? Searching through deeds and transfer papers from 1955 and 1956, I found a series of rapid land acquisitions by the federal government. Large parcels, consolidating ownership over thousands of acres surrounding and including the Willow Creek Valley. The stated purpose for these acquisitions was typically vague, for national security purposes, or for the establishment of a restricted federal zone. No mention of a town being located on this land. The acquisition process was swift, almost aggressive, with most parcels changing hands over a few months in late 1955. This corroborated the timeline I'd established. The government hadn't just restricted access, they had legally seized the land. But who owned the land before the government acquired it? The records for these specific parcels prior to the federal acquisition were frustratingly incomplete or listed ownership by shell corporations or individuals whose names were common and untraceable without more information. It was another dead end, designed, it seemed, to obscure the previous occupants. The pattern was clear: identify, acquire, restrict, erase. Merit was erased not just from maps, but from property records, census data, and local histories. The silence around it was a constructed silence. But who lived there? Why were they moved? And what exactly was Project Nightingale doing that required such extreme measures? The mystery deepened with every layer I peeled back, and the feeling of being watched, of treading on forbidden ground, grew stronger. I was no longer just a researcher. I was an accidental trespasser on a carefully guarded secret. And secrets guarded this fiercely tend to be dangerous. My investigation had just begun, and I knew it was going to lead me into territory far more complex and potentially risky than I had anticipated. The scale of the cover-up suggested the original event, whatever it was, must have been catastrophic or of immense strategic importance. And the truth about it was something the powers that be desperately wanted to keep buried forever. My next move had to be carefully considered. Pushing too hard in official channels was clearly unproductive and potentially alerted those responsible for the cover-up that someone was digging. I needed to find an alternative path, perhaps through individuals who might have peripheral knowledge or connections to the area during that period, bypassing the official narrative entirely. This would require stepping away from the digital realm and dusty archives and venturing into the territory of oral history, however difficult that might be given the passage of time and the ingrained silence surrounding the event. The ghost town of Merritt wasn't just a historical curiosity. It was a wound in time, deliberately cauterized and hidden. And I was about to try and reopen it. The challenge of finding former residents felt insurmountable. If their town was erased from all records, were they also erased? Not literally, of course, but were their identities and former addresses scrubbed from official databases? Census records from the 1950s are publicly available, but searching them is difficult without a specific location or name. And if Merritt wasn't listed as a town, how would I find anyone associated with it? I considered searching for individuals with last names appearing in any fragmented local records I could find from nearby towns that might have had connections to the Willow Creek area. But this was a shot in the dark. The government acquisitions list mentioned some individuals whose land was purchased, but tracking down elderly people or their descendants based on a name and a potentially long-ago address was a monumental task. I decided to focus on the Project Nightingale angle again, but from a different perspective. Forget government archives for a moment. What about the people who might have worked on the project? The classified ad mentioned a need for skilled labor. These weren't likely high-level scientists or military personnel who would remain anonymous. They were likely engineers, construction workers, technicians, people who lived and worked, however temporarily, in the area. They might not have lived in Merritt itself, but perhaps in temporary housing nearby, or commuted from surrounding towns before the area was fully locked down. Finding these individuals, or their descendants, seemed a more viable path to uncovering details about the project and, by extension, what happened to the town built to support it. Searching for former Project Nightingale workers proved difficult for the same reasons: lack of specific information and time. However, I did find a few oblique references in regional historical society newsletters from the late 1970s and 80s, articles about the area's post-war development. One article mentioned a brief, intense period of federal construction activity in the Willow Creek Valley in the mid-50s, employing many local tradesmen before the site became permanently restricted. It didn't use the name Project Nightingale, but the description and location matched. It mentioned that the project was shrouded in mystery, even at the time, and that workers were tight-lipped due to security oaths. Security oaths. This confirmed the sensitive nature of the work. The article also mentioned that many of these workers eventually moved away as other industries declined in the region. It was a slim lead, but it provided a potential list of professions to search for and reinforced the idea that locals were involved, however minimally, before the full lockdown. I shifted my search towards regional labor union records from the 1950s, particularly those related to construction trades. This was a long shot, as these records were often poorly kept or stored in obscure locations. I also started contacting local historical societies and libraries in towns surrounding the Willow Creek area, asking if they had any records, photographs, or personal accounts from that period that might shed light on the federal construction activity. Most had nothing specific, only confirming the general knowledge that something big was happening up the valley and then suddenly stopped. The silence was consistent. However, a librarian in a small town 50 miles away remembered an old-timer, now passed, who used to tell stories about working on a government job up the creek before it became off-limits. He never said what the job was, only that the money was good and the rules were strict. Another dead end. But it added another layer of corroboration. Personal testimony, even fragmented, confirming the existence of the project and the enforced secrecy. The most promising lead came from an unexpected source. A retired land surveyor I contacted for general information about historical surveying practices in the region. He had worked for the state in the late 1960s and early 70s. When I mentioned the Willow Creek area and the discrepancy on the maps, he became visibly uneasy. He had heard stories, he said, from older colleagues who were working in the 50s. They referred to the area as the hole, not a literal hole, but a place where data went in but never came out, a blind spot. He recalled one surveyor, a man named Miller, who was assigned to resurvey parts of the state forest boundaries in the late 50s, including the area around Willow Creek. Miller came back shaken, refused to talk about what he saw, and requested reassignment. He retired shortly after. The surveyor I was talking to didn't know what Miller had seen, only that it was clearly disturbing and related to the government's presence there. Miller was likely long gone, but the story added another piece to the puzzle. Someone saw something after the town disappeared, and that something was bad enough to traumatize a seasoned professional. This conversation, more than anything else, solidified my resolve. This wasn't just an academic exercise in historical geography anymore. This was about people. The residents of Merritt, the workers on Project Nightingale, the surveyor who saw something he shouldn't have. Their stories, their lives, and their home had been deliberately erased. The scale of the cover-up suggested something truly extraordinary had occurred. The government wasn't just hiding a failed project or a routine military installation. They were hiding something that necessitated wiping an entire community from existence. My investigation had moved from proving the town existed to understanding why it was destroyed and erased. The next phase required greater caution. I was moving from anonymous data analysis to seeking out individuals, however peripherally connected, who might hold fragments of the truth. And that significantly increased the risk. I had the name of the project, a potential time frame, and confirmation of government action and secrecy. Now, I needed the human element, the whispers and memories that the official records had failed to silence completely. It was time to step out of the archive and into the field, metaphorically and perhaps literally. The possibility that Miller, the traumatized surveyor, might still be alive, however remote, lingered. Or perhaps his family might know something, even if only fragments of stories he couldn't keep entirely to himself. Tracking down someone based on a last name and a profession from 70 years ago in a large state is challenging, but not impossible with enough dedication and the right resources. I cross-referenced state employee records, or what little was publicly available or obtainable through other means, with genealogy databases and public records. It was a long shot, but worth pursuing. While pursuing Miller, I also needed to consider the nature of Project Nightingale itself. The time frame suggested potential links to early nuclear work, biological weapons research, or advanced rocketry, aeronautics. The remote location and need for secrecy fit any of these. A research facility, a testing ground, a production site. Understanding the type of project might shed light on the potential reasons for erasing a nearby civilian population. A radiation leak, an accidental release of a pathogen, a failed experiment. All plausible, grim possibilities that would certainly necessitate extreme measures to contain and conceal. My research into Cold War projects of that era, cross-referenced with remote sites and known security protocols, provided several potential avenues, but nothing definitive that directly linked to Project Nightingale or the Willow Creek area. The government had hundreds, if not thousands, of code-named projects running concurrently in the 1950s. Finding the right one without more specific information was like finding a needle in a haystack. My best bet remained finding individuals connected to the site. The retired surveyor's mention of the whole also suggested a long-standing institutional knowledge within state agencies about the area being off-limits or sensitive, even after the initial intense period. This implied that the secrecy wasn't just about the event itself, but about the ongoing status of the site. Was it still hazardous? Was it still in use for something else, under a new name? I decided to make preliminary inquiries about accessing the state forest land covering the former site of Merritt. Officially, it was state forest, presumably open to public access for hiking, camping, etc., within designated areas. Requesting permits for scientific research, a plausible cover, or even just inquiring about hiking trails in that specific grid reference could reveal if the area was still subtly or overtly restricted. A check of current online maps of the state forest showed hiking trails and camping areas, but none seemed to penetrate the core area where Merritt was located. The trails skirted the valley, following ridgelines or staying on the periphery. This could be coincidence, or it could be another subtle layer of exclusion. An email to the State Forestry Department inquiring about trail access in the Willow Creek Valley area received a polite but vague response about sensitive ecological areas and ongoing habitat restoration efforts limiting access to certain sections. This wasn't an outright refusal, but it felt like a soft barrier. Sensitive ecological areas could mean anything, including areas contaminated by past activities. Habitat restoration could be a euphemism for capping off contaminated sites or demolishing structures. I felt a growing sense of urgency. Every piece of information I uncovered, however small, pointed to a significant event and a deliberate, ongoing cover-up. The silence wasn't passive. It was actively maintained. The question was, who was maintaining it now, and to what end? The original reasons for the secrecy might have evolved, but the commitment to keeping the truth buried remained. And I was starting to attract attention. My repeated FOIA requests for information on Cold War projects in the state, my inquiries to state agencies about historical land use and access restrictions, my delving into old county records, it all created a digital footprint. I was careful, using encrypted communication and privacy tools where possible, but I knew that anyone with sufficient resources and motivation could track my activity. The people who erased a town could certainly track a lone researcher. My investigation was entering a new, more personal phase. It was no longer just about historical maps and archives. It was about finding the human stories, the forgotten lives, and the buried truth. It required reaching out to people, navigating their potential fear or reluctance, and trying to piece together a narrative from fragments of memory and rumor. It also required a degree of physical proximity to the site itself. I couldn't fully understand the physical erasure from satellite images and old maps alone. I needed to see the land, to look for the subtle signs that 70 years of forest growth couldn't completely hide. Changes in soil composition, unnatural depressions, fragmented materials under the leaf litter. A field visit was becoming increasingly necessary, despite the potential risks and the soft barriers the state seemed to have in place. I needed to see the ghost town that the government had erased, not just on a map, but in the silent, overgrown valley where it once stood. The title I had given this investigation, "The Ghost Town the Government Erased," was proving to be chillingly accurate. But the second part, "and why you were never told," was the core mystery I still needed to solve. Why the secrecy? What were they hiding? Finding Miller or his family proved difficult. He had retired to a different part of the state, and any direct descendants seemed to have moved further afield or changed names. The trail went cold. This reinforced the idea that anyone directly connected to the events might have been incentivized or pressured to disappear or keep silent. The difficulty in finding anyone willing or able to talk directly about the period was a testament to the effectiveness of the original security measures and the lasting impact of the fear or secrecy oaths. It was clear I wasn't going to find a former resident holding a diary detailing life in Merritt and the day it was evacuated. The truth, if I was going to find it, would be in the margins, in the hints and indirections from people who were on the periphery, combined with a forensic analysis of the site itself. I decided to plan a visit to the Willow Creek area. I wouldn't attempt to enter the restricted core zone immediately, but I would hike the publicly accessible trails around the perimeter, observing the terrain, geology, and any signs of past human activity that might be visible from a distance. This would also allow me to get a feel for the remoteness and the logistical challenges the government would have faced in managing a large-scale project and subsequent erasure in this location. I would go under the guise of a recreational hiker, carrying standard gear: backpack, maps, compass, water, snacks. But my real tools would be a high-resolution camera, a GPS device to mark locations, and a notebook to record observations. I also brought a handheld radiation detector, a precaution that might seem overly dramatic, but given the potential connection to Cold War-era projects and the secrecy, it felt necessary. Better safe than sorry if sensitive ecological areas meant radioactive contamination. The drive to the Willow Creek area took several hours, the last part on winding, increasingly poorly maintained state roads. As I got closer, signs indicating state forest became more frequent. There were also occasional, older signs that felt more official, less welcoming, warning against trespassing in adjacent areas or mentioning restricted access for official use only. These signs, often faded or partly obscured by vegetation, seemed remnants of an earlier, stricter era of control, but they hadn't been removed. They served as silent sentinels, hinting that the area's sensitive past wasn't entirely forgotten by those who managed it. I parked at a designated trailhead that was listed on current state forest maps, several miles downstream from where I estimated Merritt had been located. The parking area was small, unpaved, and empty. I saw no other cars. The isolation was immediate and profound. The valley was quiet, the sound of the creek and the wind in the trees the only consistent noise. I started hiking, following a marked trail that paralleled the creek, heading generally upstream towards the estimated location of the vanished town. The forest was dense, a mix of conifers and deciduous trees, the ground covered in thick leaf litter and underbrush. It was beautiful but felt somewhat unnatural. The uniformity of the tree cover, the lack of old-growth giants one might expect in a mature forest, suggested the area had been heavily logged at some point, or the ecosystem had been disturbed. I kept an eye out for anything that seemed out of place. old fence posts, unnatural rock formations, changes in the contours of the land that didn't fit the natural slope. After about an hour, I veered off the main trail, using my GPS to navigate towards the grid coordinates of what the 1952 map showed as the center of Merritt. I was still well within what I believed was the public access zone, but off the marked path. The going became slower, pushing through dense brush and climbing over fallen logs. And then I saw it. A subtle, almost imperceptible change in the vegetation. A patch of ground where the trees seemed slightly younger, smaller than the surrounding forest. As I looked closer, I saw faint, linear depressions in the ground, hidden beneath the leaves. I cleared away some of the litter with my foot. Beneath, I found fragments of brick, concrete, and twisted metal rebar. These weren't natural. These were remnants of buildings. I checked my GPS coordinates. I was within the area marked as Merritt on the 1952 map. This wasn't just forest. This was forest growing over something. The physical erasure wasn't perfect. The government had removed the major structures, perhaps even bulldozed foundations. But they hadn't removed everything. Small pieces remained, slowly being reclaimed by nature. This was tangible proof. The town had been here. I spent several hours carefully moving through the area, scanning the ground, taking photographs and marking coordinates. I found more fragments. A piece of ceramic pipe, a shard of glass, rusted nails, a hinge. No large pieces, nothing easily identifiable as belonging to a specific type of building, just rubble. It was as if the town had been put through a giant shredder and scattered before the forest was allowed to regrow. I used my radiation detector intermittently. It remained silent, registering only background levels. Whatever happened here, it didn't seem to have left behind widespread radioactive contamination, at least not at ground level 70 years later. This potentially ruled out a major nuclear incident, but didn't exclude other possibilities like biological agents or unconventional weapons testing, which might not leave a radiation signature. Or perhaps the contamination was contained or had decayed over time. As the light began to fade, I started heading back towards the trail in my car. My mind was buzzing. I had found physical evidence of Merritt's existence exactly where the old map said it should be. The government had tried to erase it, but they hadn't been completely successful. The sheer effort involved in removing so much material and then encouraging forest regrowth was staggering. It reinforced the idea that whatever happened here was significant and the need for secrecy paramount. As I neared the marked trail, I had the distinct feeling I was being watched. It was subtle at first, a rustle in the undergrowth that didn't sound like an animal, a fleeting shadow at the edge of my peripheral vision. I stopped and listened. The forest sounds resumed, but the feeling persisted. I quickened my pace, reaching the trail and then the relatively open space of the parking area as dusk settled. My car was still the only one there. The feeling of being observed faded, but the unease lingered. It was a stark reminder that I wasn't just exploring history. I was poking at something that someone still considered sensitive, maybe even dangerous. The ghost of Merritt wasn't just in the ground. It was in the air, in the silence of the valley, and in the lingering sense of being an unwelcome intruder. The physical evidence I collected, the photos of debris, the marked GPS coordinates, was crucial. It transformed the story from an archival anomaly into a tangible reality. I now had proof, albeit circumstantial, that a settlement had been physically dismantled and erased from the landscape. This supported the administrative erasure I'd found in the records, but I still didn't know why. What event or project was so important, so dangerous, or so secret that it necessitated this level of effort? Project Nightingale remained a frustratingly vague lead. I needed to understand the nature of the project itself to understand the reason for the town's demise. My focus shifted back to the Cold War context and the types of secret government activities that were prevalent in the mid-1950s. Given the time frame and the location away from major population centers, facilities related to unconventional warfare seemed a plausible candidate. Biological or chemical weapons research and testing were highly secretive areas of development during that period. Or perhaps it was related to advanced propulsion systems or materials science, requiring isolation due to hazardous processes or highly experimental technology. The lack of significant radiation at the site, while not definitive proof of anything, did perhaps make a pure nuclear weapons test site slightly less likely, unless it was a very low-yield test or involved materials with short half-lives. However, facilities handling fissile materials or processing spent fuel could also be a possibility. The range of potential activities was vast, and without more specific information about Project Nightingale, I was still guessing. I decided to delve deeper into the history of a government land acquisition in the region during the 1950s. Were there other instances of rapid federal land grabs in remote areas of the state or neighboring states during the same period? Comparing the patterns might reveal a signature, a specific type of project that required this kind of footprint. I found records of other large land acquisitions, many tied to military bases, radar installations, or dam construction. But these projects were generally publicly acknowledged, even if specific operational details were classified. The Merit scenario was different. It was characterized by total erasure and silence. This suggested a project that was either uniquely sensitive, failed spectacularly and needed to be hidden, or had unforeseen consequences that posed a long-term risk. My investigation into Project Nightingale led me to a declassified index of Army R&D projects from the 1950s. Searching under variations of the name yielded nothing directly related to the geographical area or time frame. However, I found a brief, heavily redacted entry for a project codenamed Nightingale, managed by the Army Chemical Corps, dealing with advanced dispersal systems. The description was vague, but the Chemical Corps was responsible for chemical and biological weapons. Advanced dispersal systems could refer to methods for disseminating agents. This was a chilling possibility. A research or testing facility for biological or chemical weapons, located near a civilian town, could certainly explain the extreme secrecy and the need to erase the town if there was an accident. The redacted nature of the document prevented me from seeing the location or the full scope of the project. But it was the first time I found a government project with the name Nightingale that seemed plausibly connected to something requiring extreme secrecy and isolation. If Project Nightingale was indeed related to chemical or biological agents, the sensitive ecological areas mentioned by the Forestry Department could refer to areas of contamination. Biological agents, depending on their nature, could persist in the environment or contaminate the water table. Chemical agents could also leave behind hazardous residues. The possibility of long-term environmental contamination would certainly explain the continued restriction of the area and the reluctance to draw attention to it. It would also provide a powerful motive for erasing the town, not just to hide the project, but to hide the consequences of a potential failure or release that affected the civilian population. This possibility raised a host of new questions. If there was a release of a hazardous agent, were the residents of Merit exposed? Were they evacuated for their safety? Or was the evacuation part of a containment effort? Were they monitored afterwards? Did they suffer long-term health consequences? If the government evacuated them, where did they go? And how was their silence ensured for so long? The narrative was becoming darker, moving from a simple historical mystery to something potentially involving public health, government negligence, and a massive cover-up of human cost. The fragments of brick and metal I found in the forest floor took on a new, ominous significance. They weren't just remnants of a vanished town. They were artifacts of a potential tragedy. I decided to shift my focus to the potential human cost. If a population was exposed to a hazardous agent and then relocated, there might be records, however obscured, within public health databases, social security records, or even military health studies if the relocation was managed by the government. This was highly sensitive territory, and accessing such records would be extremely difficult, likely requiring legal challenges or leaked information. However, I started by looking for unusual health trends or clusters of specific illnesses reported in the general region in the years following the mid-1950s, particularly those that could be linked to chemical or biological exposure. Public health data from that era is often incomplete and difficult to access in detail, but broad patterns can sometimes be discerned. I found no immediate, obvious spikes in specific illnesses in the broader county area in the late 50s or 60s, but this didn't necessarily mean there was no exposure. A contained release, exposure limited to the residents of Merritt, or relocation of affected individuals could mask any statistical anomaly in the general population. The sheer scale of the proposed cover-up was daunting. Erasing a town and its people from history required a coordinated effort across multiple government agencies, land management, census bureau, potentially health services, and military intelligence. It would involve destroying or altering documents, creating plausible alternative narratives, like the state forest designation, and ensuring the silence of everyone involved, from high-level officials to the laborers who built the project and the personnel who carried out the evacuation and demolition. The fact that they seem to have been successful for 70 years is a testament to the government's capability and willingness to maintain secrecy when deemed necessary. My investigation was becoming increasingly complex and, I suspected, increasingly visible. I was no longer just an anonymous researcher. I was someone actively probing a deep and sensitive secret. The feeling of being watched had returned since my visit to the site, manifesting in small, unnerving ways. Strange clicks on my phone line, emails that looked like phishing attempts but were unusually well-timed, subtle inconsistencies in my computer's performance. It could be paranoia, but it felt too persistent to ignore. Someone, somewhere knew I was digging into Merritt and Project Nightingale, and they were paying attention. This confirmed that the secret was still live, still guarded. The why of the erasure was likely tied not just to the original event, but to ongoing concerns or liabilities. The possibility that the site remained hazardous, even after all these years, was a significant factor. If there was lingering contamination, acknowledging the town's existence and its sudden disappearance would inevitably lead to questions about why it disappeared and potentially uncover the environmental hazard. Admitting to a major environmental contamination incident 70 years ago, especially one linked to a secret weapons program, would be a massive liability for the government, both financially and reputationally. Lawsuits, demands for cleanup, public outcry. The costs would be enormous. Erasing the town erased the potential plaintiffs and witnesses. It was a cynical, but potentially effective way to bury the problem along with the truth. I needed to find more concrete evidence linking Project Nightingale, the Willow Creek area, and the potential hazardous nature of the work. The declassified Army Chemical Corps document was a lead, but it was thin. I needed something stronger. My research into chemical and biological weapons programs of the 1950s led me to information about various testing sites and research facilities. Many were located in remote areas, and some had known issues with contamination. I cross-referenced these known programs and locations with the geographical characteristics of the Willow Creek Valley and the limited information I had about Project Nightingale. Was there a specific type of research or testing that would fit the profile of rapid development, extreme secrecy, need for isolation, and potential for long-term, non-radioactive contamination? Research into biological warfare testing during the 1950s revealed programs that involved testing dispersal methods for aerosolized pathogens or simulants. These tests sometimes involved controlled releases in contained environments or open-air tests in remote locations. A town built to support such a facility or testing ground would be directly in harm's way in case of an accident or miscalculation. The timeline fit. The secrecy fit. The potential for biological contamination, which might decay over decades, but could also leave dormant spores or residues or impact local wildlife, fit the sensitive ecological areas description. This seemed like the most plausible explanation for the unique level of secrecy and erasure surrounding Merit. Project Nightingale, I hypothesized, was a biological warfare research or testing facility, and Merit was its support town, eliminated when the project ended, or worse, when something went wrong. If this hypothesis was correct, finding former residents became even more critical and more fraught with danger. Survivors of an accidental biological release, relocated and silenced, would be living proof of the government's actions and negligence. Their health records, if they could be found and interpreted correctly, might show patterns of illness consistent with exposure. But finding them after 70 years and getting them to talk about something they were likely sworn or pressured to keep silent about would be incredibly difficult. They might not even know the full truth of what happened, only that they were suddenly moved and their home vanished. I decided to focus my search on the period immediately after the town's disappearance. Where did people go when their town was dissolved? Usually they moved to nearby towns or back to their places of origin. I searched regional newspapers from late 1955 and 1956 for moving notices, changes of address, or mentions of families leaving the area under unusual circumstances. This yielded very little. It seemed the residents of Merit didn't just move, they vanished from the local social landscape. This reinforced the idea of a managed relocation, possibly to locations far from the region, perhaps even with new identities or strict instructions to maintain silence. The government had gone to extraordinary lengths to sever any ties the residents might have had to their former home and to each other. The implication was chilling. The government didn't just erase a town, they disappeared a population, at least from public view and historical record. This level of control over individual lives, even in the name of national security, was a profound overreach of power and a violation of fundamental rights. The story of Merit wasn't just about a ghost town. It was about ghost people, their lives deemed expendable or inconvenient in the pursuit of secret programs. My investigation had moved from mapping a lost place to uncovering a potential crime against its inhabitants. The silence surrounding Merit wasn't just about hiding a location or a project. It was about hiding what happened to its people. The remnants I found at the site, the buried debris, the subtle landscape changes, were physical evidence of destruction. The administrative gaps were evidence of deliberate erasure. The fragmented personal accounts and hints of government projects were clues to the cause. But the missing people were the heart of the story, the real victims of the cover-up. Without finding some trace of them, the story remained incomplete, a mystery of a place without its people. This was the hardest part of the investigation, trying to recover the human element from a history that had been systematically scrubbed clean. My attention was increasingly drawn to the practicalities of such a large-scale erasure and relocation. how would the government have done it in the 1950s? It would have required significant manpower, logistical coordination, and legal maneuvering. Emergency powers might have been invoked, perhaps citing national security or a public health crisis, which, if there was a biological release, would be technically true, albeit caused by their own actions. The speed of the town's disappearance suggested an abrupt evacuation, not a gradual decline. Residents likely had little time to gather belongings or make their own arrangements. They would have been dependent on the government for transportation, temporary housing, and financial compensation. The sheer scale of the cover-up implied that the truth was not merely embarrassing or inconvenient, but catastrophic in its implications. An uncontrolled release of a biological agent, for example, could have resulted in illness or death for the residents and potentially spread beyond the valley if not contained. Hiding such an event, especially one caused by a secret government program, would be a priority at the highest levels. The Cold War climate of fear and secrecy would have provided the ideal environment for such a cover-up to succeed. Public information was tightly controlled, and questioning government actions, especially those related to national security, was often seen as unpatriotic or even subversive. I was still operating largely in the shadows, compiling information, connecting dots, building a case based on circumstantial evidence and logical inference. But I knew that at some point, if I was going to tell this story, I would need more. I would need undeniable proof, or at least a credible source willing to speak on the record, however anonymously. And finding such a source 70 years after the fact, from a project shrouded in such intense secrecy, felt like an impossible task. Yet, the fact that I had found anything at all, the map anomaly, the county record note, the newspaper fragment, the debris at the site, suggested that the erasure wasn't perfect. There were cracks in the facade, glimpses of the buried truth. My task was to widen those cracks, to bring more of the hidden story to light. I focused again on Project Nightingale and the Army Chemical Corps link. If the project was real and related to biological agents, there might be internal histories, technical reports, or even personnel records within the Army that, however redacted, could provide more details. I submitted more targeted FOIA requests, specifically mentioning the Chemical Corps and the time frame, using keywords related to biological research, dispersal systems, and remote testing sites. The responses were the usual mix of boilerplate refusals and heavily redacted documents that offered little useful information. It was clear that the government was not going to voluntarily disclose anything related to this project or the events at Willow Creek. The silence from official sources was as much a confirmation as any document. The active withholding of information, the lack of any acknowledgement of a past settlement or a project called Nightingale in that location, spoke volumes. It confirmed that this was a topic that was still considered sensitive, still requiring protection. The people responsible for the original cover-up, or their successors, were still on guard. This reinforced the danger I was in, however subtle the signs of surveillance might be. I was challenging a narrative that had been carefully constructed and maintained for decades. My visit to the site had been revealing, providing physical confirmation of the town's fate, but I needed more. I needed to understand the layout of the project facility itself. Was it separate from the town? Located nearby? Integrated? The 1952 map only showed the town. It didn't show any large, non-residential complex in the vicinity. This suggested either the facility was built after the map was made, between 1952 and late 1955, or it was located slightly outside the surveyed town area, or perhaps it was underground or disguised. The short time frame between the town's growth and its disappearance, 1952 to 1955, suggested rapid development of both the town and the project. I returned to studying the topography of the Willow Creek Valley, using detailed digital elevation models and older geological survey maps. I looked for any unusual features, unnatural level areas on slopes, signs of significant excavation or earth moving that weren't explained by natural processes or known mining activity. The valley floor was relatively flat near the creek, suitable for building, which was where Merritt was located. But there were also steeper slopes and small plateaus nearby. Was there a possibility the facility was built into a hillside or on a less accessible plateau? Without a map of the facility itself, this was speculation. However, reviewing the geological survey maps, I noticed some notations from the early 1950s regarding exploratory drilling in the hills surrounding the valley. The purpose of the drilling wasn't specified. While this could relate to resource extraction, it could also be related to assessing the geological suitability for underground construction or waste disposal. The combination of rapid land acquisition, an exclusion zone, a likely secret project, and exploratory drilling suggested a significant, possibly subsurface, facility was constructed in the area around the same time Merritt boomed. This led me to consider another possibility for the project's nature: underground testing or research. This could be related to nuclear effects, weapons storage, or highly sensitive experiments requiring maximum containment. A facility built deep underground would certainly require a support town nearby for its construction and operational personnel, and the subsequent need to erase the town would be just as compelling if the facility was compromised, or the project was deemed too sensitive to remain even as a known historical site. The concept of erasing a location from memory was a recurring theme in Cold War secrecy, especially related to sites involved in the most sensitive aspects of weapons development. The story of Merritt was no longer just about a town that disappeared. It was a window into the darkest, most secretive corners of the Cold War. It spoke to the lengths the government was willing to go to protect its secrets, even at the cost of its own citizens' homes and histories. The people of Merritt were collateral damage, their existence inconvenient to a narrative of national security that demanded their erasure. The question of why they were never told wasn't just about informing the public. It was about the profound injustice of having your past, your home, your community deliberately wiped from the record, leaving you a ghost in your own history. My mission felt clearer than ever: to bring their story back into the light, to challenge the deliberate silence that had held for 70 years. But I knew that the forces that had enforced that silence were still present, still powerful, and unlikely to welcome my intrusion. The challenge of finding survivors or their descendants remained paramount. I shifted my strategy, moving away from official records and towards more informal networks. Genealogy groups focused on the broader region, online forums dedicated to local history and lost towns, even distant relatives of people known to have lived in nearby areas in the 1950s. It was a painstaking process of sifting through mentions, names, and fragments of family histories, looking for any connection to the Willow Creek Valley or the period of the town's existence. I also considered placing anonymous queries in local newspapers or online forums, asking if anyone had memories of a settlement near Willow Creek in the 1950s, or knew anyone who lived in the area then. This was risky, potentially alerting the very people I was trying to avoid, but it might shake loose a buried memory or connect me with someone who knew something. I crafted a carefully worded query, general enough not to immediately scream government cover-up investigation, but specific enough to potentially resonate with someone who had a connection. I posted it on several regional history forums and sent it to a few small-town newspapers willing to publish community notices. The response was minimal. A few people remembered hearing rumors of a government project up the valley back in the day, but nothing specific. One person mentioned their grandparents had friends who lived in the area but moved away suddenly in the mid-50s, losing touch. They didn't remember the friends' names. It was frustratingly vague, another dead end. The wall of silence was remarkably effective, built not just with secrecy oaths and document destruction, but with the passage of time and the fading of memory. However, a breakthrough came from an unexpected source. I received an email response to one of my online queries from someone who used a pseudonym and was extremely cautious. They claimed their father had worked on a construction crew for a classified government project in a remote valley in the state in the mid-50s. They didn't name the location or the project, but the timing and description were promising. Their father, they said, rarely talked about the job, but when he did, it was with a mix of pride in the important work and unease about the secrecy and the conditions. He mentioned a temporary town nearby where some of the workers lived, separate from the main facility. He also mentioned an incident towards the end of the project that led to everything being shut down and everyone being sent away quickly. He never said what the incident was, only that it was bad and involved people getting sick. This was it. The first credible, albeit anonymous and second-hand account from someone connected to the project. The mention of a temporary town, an incident, and people getting sick aligned chillingly with my hypothesis about a biological event and the fate of merit. I responded cautiously, asking if they had any documents, photos, or even just names associated with the project or the town. They were hesitant, clearly fearful of repercussions. They didn't have documents. Their father had destroyed anything related to the project, fearing he might break his security oath even decades later. But they had fragments of memory, stories their father told in oblique ways over the years. They remembered him mentioning unusual health issues among some of the workers and town residents before the shutdown. Respiratory problems, fever, extreme fatigue. Symptoms that could be consistent with exposure to certain biological agents. The person was unwilling to reveal their identity or location or share any information that could trace back to them. This was understandable given the history of secrecy and potential repercussions. But they were willing to share what they remembered in a secure, anonymous channel. This was a crucial development. It provided a human dimension to the story, a glimpse into the lives of the people affected and the nature of the event that likely led to Merritt's erasure. The incident their father mentioned was almost certainly the catalyst for the evacuation and the subsequent cover-up. And the fact that people got sick strongly supported the biological hazard hypothesis. My anonymous source's information corroborated much of what my archival research and site visit had suggested. A secret government project, a support town, a rapid shutdown due to an incident, and subsequent government efforts to ensure silence. It also added a critical piece: the human cost, the illness that precipitated the town's demise. The narrative was beginning to cohere, painting a grim picture of a government project gone wrong, with the civilian population paying the price, their suffering then compounded by deliberate historical erasure. The why of the cover-up was becoming clearer: to hide a failed experiment, a dangerous release, and the resulting harm to American citizens. The anonymous source also mentioned something else, something their father had found disturbing even years later. He believed that not everyone from the town was evacuated immediately. He had a vague memory of a quarantine being imposed, with some residents unable to leave due to illness or exposure risk. He didn't know what happened to them during or after the quarantine. This added another, even darker layer to the story. Were some residents essentially abandoned or held against their will in the quarantine zone? What was their fate? This chilling possibility amplified the injustice of the cover-up. It wasn't just about erasing a town. It was potentially about concealing deaths or severe, ongoing illness among a group of its citizens. The sensitive ecological areas might not just refer to environmental contamination, but also to burial sites or areas where quarantine facilities once stood. This information, though fragmented and second-hand, provided a powerful impetus to continue the investigation. The stakes were higher now. This wasn't just history. It was about uncovering a potential atrocity hidden in plain sight for 70 years. My next step was to try and verify the anonymous source's claims, particularly regarding the health issues and potential quarantine. This would be extremely difficult, as official health records from that era, especially those related to classified projects, would be heavily protected. However, looking for patterns of relocation among families from that county in the mid-1950s, and then attempting to trace those families forward, might yield some clues. If a group of families from the Willow Creek area suddenly appeared in health records in a different state years later with unusual similar chronic illnesses, it could be a significant data point. The anonymous source went silent after our initial exchange, their fear apparently overriding their desire to share their father's story further. I understood their caution, but it left me with critical information that was difficult to independently verify. I was back to relying on my own research, albeit with a clearer picture of what I was looking for. My focus now was on finding any evidence, however tangential, of the relocated residents, their health status, and the specifics of the incident. This felt like the most important and most challenging phase of the investigation. Recovering the lost lives of Merritt was the ultimate goal. My research into the relocation of populations due to government projects or environmental hazards in the 1950s yielded some general information about how such processes were handled or mishandled during that era. There were precedents for rapid evacuations due to dam construction, military base expansions, or nuclear testing fallout. However, the complete erasure of the town's history and the difficulty in tracing its residents seemed unique to Merritt. This suggested a deliberate strategy beyond simple relocation. It pointed to a need to prevent the former residents from ever discussing their experience or their former home in a way that could expose the truth about Project Nightingale and the incident. I spent months sifting through digitized newspapers, genealogical records, and public archives from surrounding states, looking for any trace of families who might have originated from the Willow Creek area in the mid-1950s and whose movements or health histories seemed unusual. It was tedious work, often leading to dead ends, but slowly, painstakingly, I started identifying potential candidates, families who appeared to move suddenly from the general region around the same time Merritt vanished, and whose later lives showed some unexplained challenges, such as chronic health problems or difficulty maintaining stable employment or residency. These were tenuous connections, based on inference and correlation rather than direct proof, but they provided a possible path forward. Tracing these families forward through the decades was complex, involving navigating privacy laws and accessing records that were not always publicly available. It required piecing together fragments from census data, death records, obituaries, and sometimes even property records or court documents. I was looking for patterns, multiple members of a family suffering from similar, unusual illnesses, or a family history marked by unexplained hardship or transience that might be consistent with the long-term effects of trauma, illness, and displacement. One family, in particular, caught my attention. They appeared in the county records in the early 1950s, living in the Willow Creek area, likely in Merritt, though the town wasn't named. Then they vanished from those records in late 1955. Years later, I found them in public health records in a different state, accessing specialized medical care for a rare respiratory condition that seemed unusually prevalent among several family members across different generations. There was nothing in the records that explained the origin of this condition. Could this be one of the families from Merritt, suffering the long-term consequences of exposure to a biological agent? It was a tantalizing possibility, but far from proof. Contacting these potential survivors or their descendants was the most delicate part of the investigation. I couldn't just call them up and ask if their family was poisoned by a secret government project 70 years ago. I needed to approach them with caution and sensitivity, perhaps under the guise of genealogical research or historical inquiry into the Willow Creek area. I prepared a careful script, focusing on their family history and any potential connections to the region in the 1950s, hoping to gently probe for information without alarming them. My first attempt was unsuccessful. The person I contacted was polite but distant, confirming their family had lived in the area briefly in the 1950s but had left and didn't maintain contact. They were unwilling to discuss family health history. The wall of silence, built perhaps on fear, trauma, or simply the passage of time and the loss of memory, remained formidable. Subsequent attempts yielded similar results. Polite brush-offs, reluctance to delve into the past, or simply no response. It was clear that decades of silence had taken their toll, making it incredibly difficult to penetrate the veil of secrecy that still surrounded Merritt and its people. However, one descendant of a potential Merritt family, after several cautious exchanges, agreed to talk to me, but only over the phone and anonymously. They didn't remember living in the area themselves, as they were born shortly after their family left. But they remembered stories their grandparents and parents told, fragmented memories of a place they loved, but had to leave suddenly. They spoke of a rapid departure, being told it was for their safety due to a problem at the nearby government facility. They also confirmed that many members of their family, including those who lived in the area in the 1950s, suffered from chronic, unexplained health issues later in life, particularly respiratory and autoimmune problems. They had always suspected it was related to whatever happened back then, but they had no proof and were discouraged from talking about it. Their family had been given some financial assistance by the government after they left, but it came with strict instructions to sign non-disclosure agreements and not discuss the circumstances of their departure or their former home with anyone. This was the first concrete evidence I had of the government directly compensating and silencing the residents. The non-disclosure agreements explained a lot about the persistent silence. The government hadn't just erased the town, they had actively suppressed the voices of its people, using financial leverage and legal threats. This confirmed the deliberate nature of the cover-up and the government's awareness of the potential harm caused by Project Nightingale. The descendant didn't know the name of the project or the exact nature of the incident, but their testimony provided invaluable confirmation of the key elements: sudden evacuation, government involvement, health problems, and enforced silence. It also confirmed that at least some residents were still alive, however scattered and silenced. The fragmented account from the descendant, combined with the physical evidence from the site, the administrative anomalies, and the hints about Project Nightingale, allowed me to construct a plausible, albeit still incomplete, narrative. A secret government project, likely related to biological warfare, was established in the remote Willow Creek Valley in the early 1950s. A town, Merritt, was built to support it. An incident occurred in late 1955, likely involving a release of a hazardous agent, causing illness among the residents and workers. The government swiftly evacuated the town, imposed an exclusion zone, and subsequently dismantled and erased Merritt from all records. Residents were relocated, compensated, and silenced through non-disclosure agreements. Their health problems likely a long-term consequence of the exposure, hidden from public view. The land was then reforested to further conceal the site. The ongoing restrictions on the land were likely due to lingering environmental contamination or the continued sensitivity of the site. The story of Merritt was a chilling example of the potential human cost of unchecked government secrecy and the pursuit of potentially dangerous technologies during the Cold War. It wasn't just a forgotten town. It was a buried scandal, a testament to lives disrupted and histories deliberately erased. The why you were never told was simple. The government didn't want you to know. They didn't want the public to know about the risky project, the accident, the harm caused to their own citizens, or the lengths they went to cover it up. The story challenged the narrative of benevolent government action and exposed a darker side of Cold War America, where national security justifications could be used to justify profound injustices. My investigation had revealed a ghost town, but more importantly, it had hinted at the ghost people, the residents of Merritt whose lives were forever altered and whose voices were deliberately silenced. Bringing their story to light felt like a moral imperative, but I still lacked the definitive proof, the unredacted document naming the project and its purpose, the official report on the incident, or a willing survivor with irrefutable evidence. The path forward was uncertain, fraught with the risks of challenging a powerful entity committed to maintaining its secrets. But the story of Merritt and its people deserved to be told, to be brought out of the 70 years of imposed darkness and into the light. The ghost town was real, and the reasons for its erasure were more disturbing than I had ever imagined. The challenge now was to find a way to present the story to a wider audience. The evidence I had compiled was compelling to me, having spent years researching it, but it was largely circumstantial. A collection of anomalies, fragments of documents, anonymous testimony, and physical remnants in the forest floor. Against the official silence and the 70 years of historical erasure, it might not be enough to break through the skepticism or counter the likely denial from government sources. I needed something more concrete, something that could not be easily dismissed. I considered revisiting the site with more advanced equipment. Ground-penetrating radar might reveal the layout of foundations or buried structures beneath the forest floor. Soil and water samples could be tested for chemical or biological residues, although identifying specific agents after 70 years would be incredibly difficult, if not impossible, depending on their nature and persistence. These methods were expensive and potentially drew unwanted attention, requiring permits for scientific investigation on state land, which I had already been subtly discouraged from accessing freely. However, the possibility of finding definitive physical evidence of the facility or contamination was tempting. Another avenue was to focus on the administrative and financial trails. Large government projects, even secret ones, generate bureaucracy and cost money. Was there any way to find obscure financial records from the 1950s that might relate to Project Nightingale, the construction of the facility or the town, or the compensation paid to residents? This was another long shot, buried deep in federal archives and potentially obscured by code names and dummy corporations. But following the money could sometimes lead to unexpected places. I also continued my search for any individuals who might have had tangential knowledge and were not bound by direct security oaths or non-disclosure agreements. Perhaps someone involved in the logistical support for the project, a supplier who delivered materials, or even people from nearby towns who had social interactions with Merritt residents before the shutdown. These connections were likely few and far between, and memories would have faded significantly over 70 years, but they represented a potential source of independent corroboration. My investigation had become a solitary pursuit, driven by a growing sense of responsibility to the vanished town and its forgotten people. The silence that had protected the secret for so long was a powerful force, reinforced by institutional inertia, fear, and the simple passage of time. Breaking through it required patience, persistence, and a willingness to push boundaries. I knew that the risk of drawing direct attention from those who wished the secret to remain buried was increasing. The subtle signs of surveillance I had experienced earlier had subsided, but that didn't mean I was no longer being watched. It could simply mean the watchers were more careful now, or that they were waiting to see how far I would go. The story of merit was a microcosm of larger issues: government accountability, the ethics of secret programs, the treatment of civilians in the name of national security, and the power of the state to control narrative and erase history. It was a story that deserved to be told, not just as a historical curiosity, but as a cautionary tale. The ghost town of Merit was a monument to a hidden past, a scar on the landscape and on the historical record, a reminder that sometimes the most profound truths are found in the places the government tried hardest to make you forget. And I was determined to remember. My efforts to find definitive documentary proof continued, but the consistent absence of records or the heavy redaction of those I found reinforced the thoroughness of the original cover-up. It seemed unlikely I would uncover a smoking gun in an archive after 70 years. The most promising path still seemed to lie in finding individuals connected to the story: former residents, workers, or anyone with peripheral knowledge who might be willing to share their experience, however fragmented. The anonymous descendant's testimony had been a breakthrough, confirming the core elements of the story. But one anonymous source, however credible, was not enough to tell the full story or provide irrefutable proof for a wider audience. I decided to focus my efforts on the region surrounding Willow Creek again, this time spending more time on the ground, talking to older residents in nearby towns, visiting local historical societies, again, and trying to build trust within the community, hoping to uncover someone who might have a piece of the puzzle or know someone who did. I adopted a different approach, presenting myself not as an investigator but as a historical researcher interested in the post-war development of the area, including temporary settlements or projects. This felt less confrontational and might encourage people to share memories they considered innocuous. This slower, more personal approach yielded some results, albeit small ones. One elderly woman in a nearby town remembered her father complaining about the sudden closure of the road leading into the valley in the mid-50s, and rumors of a government sickness up there. Another person mentioned that several families from the valley area moved away very quickly, some without even selling their property properly, leaving things behind. These were just whispers, echoes of events long past, but they added weight to the narrative of a sudden, health-related incident and an abrupt evacuation. The key to unlocking the full story, I realized, might not be in finding a single piece of undeniable evidence, but in accumulating enough corroborating accounts and fragments of proof that the sheer weight of it becomes undeniable. The physical remnants at the site, the administrative gaps, the hints of government projects, the anonymous testimony about illness and silencing, and the local whispers. Together, they formed a powerful, albeit circumstantial, case. The challenge was to weave these disparate threads into a cohesive and convincing narrative that could stand up to scrutiny and official denial. I began structuring the story, outlining the parts, deciding how to present the evidence I had gathered. I knew I had to be meticulous, clearly separating verified facts from plausible inferences and the less certain elements based on rumor or fragmented testimony. The goal was not to sensationalize, but to present a compelling case based on the available evidence, highlighting the deliberate nature of the erasure and the likely reasons behind it. The narrative needed to convey the unsettling reality of a government capable of making an entire town and its history disappear. The title I had chosen, "The Ghost Town the Government Erased, and Why You Were Never Told," captured the essence of the story. It promised an uncovering of a deliberate act of historical cleansing and an explanation for the silence surrounding it. The story needed to deliver on that promise, piecing together the fragments of Merritt's brief existence and abrupt demise, and exposing the forces that ensured its disappearance from the collective memory. It was a story about memory, erasure, power, and the resilience of truth, however deeply buried. The process of writing the story was as challenging as the research itself. It required weaving together disparate pieces of information, maintaining a consistent tone, and building tension while staying grounded in the realistic possibilities of a historical cover-up. Each part had to contribute to the unfolding mystery, revealing new layers of the story while reinforcing the central theme of deliberate erasure. I focused on presenting the evidence as I found it, reflecting the investigative process and allowing the reader to follow the breadcrumbs that led to the hidden truth. The most difficult part was portraying the human element, the lives of the residents of Merritt, without having direct access to their stories. I had to rely on inference, on the few hints of their existence in the records, and on the second-hand accounts of their sudden displacement and subsequent struggles. Their story was told largely through their absence, a testament to the effectiveness of the government's efforts to erase them. But their absence was also a powerful presence, the empty space in the history that spoke volumes about what was lost and what was hidden. As I neared the completion of the story, I felt a sense of both accomplishment and apprehension. I had pieced together a compelling narrative about a forgotten town and a deliberate cover-up. But I knew that telling this story publicly carried risks. The forces that had maintained the silence for 70 years might not welcome its unveiling. However, the potential impact of bringing this story to light, challenging the official narrative, highlighting the human cost of Cold War secrecy, and giving a voice, however indirectly, to the forgotten residents of Merritt, outweighed the risks. The story of Merritt was a reminder that history is not always what is recorded in the official archives. Sometimes, the most important stories are found in the gaps, the anomalies, the deliberate silences. They are in the physical remnants hidden beneath the forest floor, in the whispered memories passed down through generations, and in the unsettling realization that what you see and what you are told is not always the whole truth. The ghost town of Merritt was real, and its story, finally told, was a testament to the enduring power of truth to emerge, even after 70 years of deliberate erasure. My final task was to ensure the narrative flowed seamlessly across the 8 parts, building the mystery and revealing the truth gradually, leaving the reader with a full understanding of what happened to Merritt and why its story was buried. It was a story of a place that ceased to exist, not by nature's will or economic hardship, but by the deliberate act of a government determined to hide a dangerous secret. And in telling that story, I hope to honor the memory of the town and its people, bringing them back from the shadows of historical erasure and into the light of public knowledge. The ghost town of Merritt would remain a physical absence, but its story would no longer be silent. The story was complete, a testament to months of painstaking research and the relentless pursuit of a hidden truth. It began with a simple anomaly on a map and ended with a chilling narrative of government secrecy, a dangerous project, and the deliberate erasure of a town and its people. The 8 parts chronicled the journey from initial discovery to the uncovering of plausible motives and methods behind the cover-up, building a case based on a mosaic of circumstantial evidence and fragmented human testimony. It painted a picture of a past that was not merely forgotten, but actively suppressed, a history deemed too inconvenient or too damaging to be allowed into the public consciousness. The town of Merritt, however brief its existence, was a real place, inhabited by real people. Their lives, their homes, their community were sacrificed and then systematically erased to protect a secret. Project Nightingale, likely a dangerous biological warfare initiative, was the probable cause of their displacement and the subsequent cover-up. The incident, the suspected release of a hazardous agent, was the catalyst for the abrupt evacuation and the decades of silence. The sensitive ecological areas and restricted access were likely ongoing measures to manage potential environmental contamination or maintain the secrecy of the site's past use. The non-disclosure agreements and the difficulty in tracing former residents highlighted the government's determined effort to silence the survivors and prevent the truth from emerging. The narrative laid bare the mechanisms of the cover-up, the administrative erasure from maps, records, and histories, the physical dismantling and concealment of the site, the legal and financial measures used to silence the affected population, and the long-term maintenance of secrecy through restricted access and possibly ongoing monitoring. It demonstrated the extent to which a government could go to control information and manipulate history, even at the expense of its own citizens. The story of Merit served as a powerful, albeit fictionalized, illustration of the potential consequences of unaccountable power and the dangers inherent in prioritizing state secrecy over transparency and human well-being. Presenting this story to the public would be a challenge. It lacked the single, irrefutable piece of evidence that often characterizes major historical revelations. There was no leaked document explicitly detailing the entire plot, no deathbed confession from a key official, no undiscovered archive spilling all the secrets. Instead, the case rested on the cumulative weight of multiple disparate clues that, when pieced together, pointed compellingly towards a deliberate act of erasure motivated by a need to conceal a dangerous and failed secret project. The impact of the story would depend on its ability to resonate with the reader, to convey the unsettling reality of a hidden history and the human cost of secrecy. It needed to provoke questions about what else might be buried beneath the official narrative, what other stories of forgotten places and people might be waiting to be uncovered. The ghost town of Merit was a powerful symbol of this hidden history, a silent witness to events that someone desperately wanted the world to forget. My investigation had ended, in a sense, with the completion of the narrative. But the story itself felt like just the beginning. It was a call to look closer at the edges of the map, at the inconsistencies in the records, at the places shrouded in unexplained silence. The ghost town of Merit was gone, but its story, however incomplete, could now be told. And in telling it, I hope to ensure that the people who lived there, however briefly, and the events that led to their disappearance, however secret, would no longer be entirely forgotten. Their history, deliberately erased, could begin its slow, difficult journey back into the light. The truth, however buried, however fragmented, had a way of leaving traces, and sometimes all it takes is someone willing to look for them. The ghost of Merit was not just in the overgrown valley, but in the deliberate gaps in the historical record. And in filling those gaps, even partially, the town and its story could finally reclaim a place in the collective memory. It was a sobering testament to the power of secrets and the resilience of truth. And it served as a potent reminder that the past is not always settled, and that sometimes the most important histories are the ones that were never supposed to be told.